Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Okay, so we're back for episode 2 of what I think will be episode 2 of the Caffeine Stream, the podcast of Caffeine and Philosophy. I'm Chris, aka C.B. Robertson, and I'm here with my wife, Sierra, to talk about a subject that's been near and dear to our hearts for the last couple years, but it seemed like a good segue from the last more morbid podcast about a very dark subject, school shooters, and maybe some of the religious origins of that. And so why not talk about the other side of that? Wholesome paganism, as opposed to the wholesome Christianity that our culture is more used to, I suppose.
Yeah, more familiar with. I think this is this is a topic that, I mean, as you say, is very near and dear to our hearts, of course, because we have children and we have to make the decision about, how to bring them up. And it's something, I feel like this is something we have been iterating towards over the course of our marriage and our parenthood. And I know you're not totally content with the title Wholesome Paganism. I'm rather attached to it at this point, but...
Well, it does feel a little overly self-congratulatory, but it does distinguish it, at least.
Yeah, well, I feel like you're the one who really kind of inspired... Well, you obviously have been, for lack of a better word, shepherding us in this direction and acting very much as kind of a spiritual leader in our family. This is what you like to think about, right? Obviously, you wrote The Hero and the Man, like talking about pagan cultures and about what those religions used to look like in practice, not just like as esoteric imaginations of like, oh, back in the day when people were men, when men were men, thinking about it really practically. Obviously, this is like what you've spent a ton of time on. And so I feel like you had the seeds of this idea a long time ago. And I've put the word wholesome on it, but you really identified that there's a problem with paganism.
Right. Well, and speaking of manly men, to borrow a Donovanism, I feel like I've been the shepherd at the borders of these concepts and ideas, and you've actually been the one more guiding things within the house, as far as what books and holiday schedules and all of the logistic stuff that makes any real way of life work. But so I think most people who've been in the pagan world will know what I'm talking about here. The vast majority of the neo-pagan movement, and anything touched by the New Age movement, has a kind of dark aesthetic and feeling to it. It tends to be Gnostic. It tends to be just very occult, yeah, and left-hand path in a not so great way. And, well, I shouldn't say not so great, but a way that is not appealing to a portion of the population that is required for future generations to happen. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the initial sort of seed of this idea of, why is it that the pagan world that has emerged, the pagan culture that has emerged in the United States under, for example, Wicca or Thelema and these various other iterations of, more overt pagan cultures are so dark and
creepy.
Yeah. But, maybe wholesome is a better word, because there's something very, what's the right word? Very narrow in that worldview. It's usually centered around knowledge and esoteric knowledge. And it turns off a lot of the people that you would need to actually make this stuff take off. My impression of these, of the New Age movement is that it drew in a lot of people who were just rejecting Christianity. And so they wanted to reject all of it, including the wholesome part, including the family part, which is ironic because there are aspects of Christian theology that might incline sincere believers to reject the family part as well, sort of in accordance with, Pope Urban II's speech at Claremont: "Abandon your families, go follow the cross." But to the credit of the church, they have managed to overcome that and established a fairly wholesome culture that, I think also to its credit, in some cases, isn't excessively family oriented. Like, it's not all about the family, but it has a place for that too, in a way that you would be hard pressed to find a place for family in a Wicca community. I think, at least that's my impression. It's certainly true of their imagery and their artwork and the culture they put out in their online spaces where they're trying to draw people in.
Yeah, I mean, definitely my, in my own explorations of, Instagram and even Pinterest, it's like there are some, the things that head toward women, at least, I get a lot of more of the, Etsy witches and crystals and oils and that sort of thing. As soon as you dig into them, you very quickly realize that these are some lonely women alone with their crystals and their moon gazing and their journals.
Totally alone. They've got their cats too, right?
Oh, okay. Yes, and the raven and all the other animals that they look at out their window because they are city dwelling.
And a tarantula, maybe.
Yeah, right. And they almost always, as soon as I dig into any particular individual, I'm like, oh, this is what you do instead of meeting people. Okay. I've also am acquainted with some of the more masculine side of the pagan community, and there's a lot of black and bones and creepy.
All the death metal.
Yeah, which, I mean, I'm a heterosexual woman. Like, I'm not knocking it, but like, it definitely, you don't see, you just don't see the crossover between these very pagan organizations and like a very clear space for women and children and family.
Yeah, and it's again, I think it would be a misstep in the opposite direction. They always say heresies come in pairs, to make it all about the family either. Just a religion out of nothing but the family would be, I think, would lose a lot of people as quickly as anything else. But the nice idea of a phrase like wholesome paganism, and it's growing on me the more I think about it, is that it captures the holistic nature of what someone engaging in a pagan lifestyle would be trying to do, which is to have a more balanced and virtuous life. At least that would be that's sort of our reason for taking this. Most of these religions, I should say a lot of religions, not most, but a lot of religions that are celebrated today, the draw is sort of in the extremity and the radicalism, the asceticism that it calls people to. And that's one of the things that I think makes the occult and esoteric paths that dominate much of darker paganism today turn out such unsuccessful, tragic characters.
Well, and I would add to that too that like the test of a religion's staying power is in its iterativeness. If it is not possible, or if it's not encouraged, if it's not possible because no one had kids, and it's not possible because once you had kids, they turned around and looked at what you did and went, "We are not doing that. Dad was crazy." Your religion kind of fails. I realize obviously that there are some fairly successful cult, I almost said cult, not in a derogatory way, but it is true. There are some denominations of Christianity that every member is, celibate lifelong, and you have to convert to join. And I'm thinking of the Friends. What are they? The Quakers.
Something like that.
Yeah, it's one of the there are several who, you are not encouraged to have kids. The only way to gain members is for people to choose to convert. So obviously there are some that can sustain themselves over time, but those are the exception, not the rule, right?
Well, sustenance is an interesting like metric for gauging the success of a religion, because it's a very earthly metric, right? Many of these religions are not trying to sustain themselves. The worldview is such that sustainability on earth is not really the point, is not really relevant, maybe is not even desirable, especially in some of the Eastern wings of Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth.
Well, and that itself to me is interesting, and I think that speaks to me to the aspect of human nature that does want sustainability. I think there's something fundamentally at odds.
There's something missing in those.
There's like, it is a fundamental aspect of human nature, and not just humans because like, oh, we have thoughts and are conscious, but like, we are mammals. We are driven to sexually reproduce. That is, like all living things, we are driven to reproduce. Even viruses want to reproduce. So any, ideology that goes against that, to me, is you have to make a choice to pursue that ideology, because anything that stands against your natural, like, mammalian desires must be ideological. So you have to make a decision about whether that's the one you want to pursue or not. And for us, having kids, having a family, and leading it in a more earthly way is what we've chosen to do.
Yeah, and it's not the whole picture. I mean, like, we still read books, if people believe that or not, and do other things. But it is a central pillar, and I think if wholesome paganism were to replace the occult tradition that's been kind of dominant in the United States basically since Aleister Crowley, then it would have to leave room for that esoteric stuff, because there is some value there, but that can't be all that there is. And it can't even be, I don't think it can even be the central thing.
No, and I would agree. And I feel like I'm seeing quite a few men who are Christian, who are trying to, I don't want to cross too many people, but I see many people who are trying to instill more family values, and they're doing it with a Christian backbone. And the rub that I see there is, the quotes that you've mentioned in Holy Nihilism, directly from the Bible, that do at the bottom of it put God and family in opposition, God and nation in opposition. So for me, a much easier way to square that, or to round that square peg, to make it fit, is to let go of the Christianity part, take the family and the nation and the religion and put those together in a much more earthly realm. Recognize that, I think that the desire for paganism is so barely below the surface, and a lot of people are trying to slap some Christianity on there to get some culture back. And I think that there is a way for a not creepy occult, but still religiously deep paganism to exist, that also has a touch point and a reference for women and for kids. We have kids. We have 3 so far, God willing.
Well, and I feel like this is where we're getting sort of out of my wheelhouse and more into your home territory as far as the actual application. So what does this actually look like in practice? So we're not doing the Christian thing, and we're also not doing, weird Thelema black metal hybrid stuff, as cool as that might be for a certain period of your 20s or whatever. And it even informed some of our reasons for moving to where we moved to, and how we set up our house, bringing animals into our kids' lives at an early age for a whole host of reasons on that regard. But you have a lot of thoughts on like books and TV shows and things like that.
Yeah, well, like I said, I feel like a lot of the pagan impulses are like very barely under the surface, and if you just look, they're right there. And thank you to the Canadian Broadcasting Company for your 5 years production of Little Bear, which is still widely available on YouTube and Amazon, and frankly is the most pagan show I've ever seen in my life. They follow the seasons. They do extremely seasonal activities. It's actually fairly regarded among child experts as being a slow living kind of TV show. So unlike Sesame Street, where it's like trying to teach you a lesson or trying to teach you the letter A, you're learning life skills by watching children at a slow pace do things. It's a fantastic show. I've watched every episode many times.
Let me make a brief interruption here, because for some people, I think the meaning of pagan is going to require some explanation on here. So when we're talking about pagan, we're borrowing from the Roman paganus, right? Which describes, it was originally an insult that meant like something like country bumpkin, and it was basically used by early Roman Christians to describe rural country folk, sort of like how we call rednecks today. But paganism in historical practice has almost always been a very localized and very rural thing. So it's not urban, it's not centralized, it's not monotheistic as a byproduct of those two former things. So in our view, pagan has deep connections with the rural setting, the rural lifestyle, and so forth.
Yeah, and technically we do live in what I suppose could be considered the suburbs, so it's not exactly that we're like out on a farm here. But the seasonality, being aware of the seasons and taking time to pace your day and your life around the actual passage of time through the year is something you could do even if you did live in the city. The fact that the first thing I want to mention is a television show reveals that I have electricity. So, we are not Luddites, though we may be your neighborhood pagans. Yeah, the focus on the seasonality, and it's a lot of this Chris laid out. You laid out, babe, in Letter to Anwei. So you had the seed of this idea, and you laid a lot of the groundwork there, and it's something that you and I have been developing over this time. And when you actually are parenting and trying to figure out what to entertain your children with, and you're looking at TV shows and you're looking at books, and you're looking for a quality kids book to instill the right values.
I will throw out, chickens have been fantastic entertainment for the kids, though.
Oh, yes. Well, so that's the next thing. So like after the basic forms of entertainment, children's books, as best as you can, try and find something seasonal that reflects the passage of time. We've got many selection of classical stories. Like we just picked up recently a copy of Iron John for kids, St. George and the Dragon. Oh, I have another one that I can't think of the name of, but we've got many. We've
got a couple different versions of Kids Odyssey.
Yes,
We've got Gilgamesh. Yes. We've got, St. George is kind of Christian in its modern form, but it has some very, very old, probably proto-Beowulf pagan origins.
Yeah, and my perception of this, like my choice in some of those books is to do a combination of not just the explicitly pagan, but also just kind of cultural knowledge. I want my kids to be aware of things. So I recently picked up a primer of Shakespeare quotes for kids. And there are lots of ways that you can just keep your kid conscious of the culture that they are in, aware of the culture that they really do live in, but also maybe not necessarily so heavily spiritually focused as many Christian households might be.
Yeah, well, and I think the underlying thing, I don't know how long we've been going, we might be getting close to wrapping this up, but to me, as we're walking through and laying these things out, it feels like the overarching theme of all of these things is connection to your environment, connection to your family, to where you come from, to the stories of your culture, connection to everything that is pertinent to living a good life. and respecting those things and growing and understanding them, understanding how life works, how food works, where food comes from, how stories work, what they sound like, what they do in our culture, how they inspire us to emulate things, maybe to be aware of that and not be led astray. But I think that might be a topic for another discussion. But yeah, just all of those connective features. And it's one of those things that Christianity, not to make this a whole Christian bashing thing, but the inner theology of Christianity is so intimately bound up with a rejection of everything in this world, and a rejection, a disconnection from the things in this world in order to facilitate a connection with the hereafter. And it seems like such a tragedy that the pagans of the last 100 years said, well, we'll reject it in a different way instead.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly what I think is wrong with the kind of mainline general. When you hear the word pagan, you immediately start thinking of like weird people doing weird stuff and like naked women jumping over bonfires.
It's not the worst thing in the world, I'll just say.
Beltane comes every year, but there are so many other things, and like I mentioned, you didn't touch on a lot of these things in Letter to Anwei. The interconnectedness with family. So, we're very lucky we moved from a more urban place to a more rural place. So we're within driving distance of your family. So we can still fairly regularly see your parents and your siblings, who are starting to move on and have their own families here in the near future too. Which means, aunts and uncles and cousins. And, we are very, very close. We actually moved into a town that facilitated us being able to be all in the same area here with my family. So we've got my parents, my brother, my grandma. So we have 4 generations of women all living in the same town and able to regularly see each other, have Sunday dinner. The mundaneness of spending time with your family can really, I think a lot of, especially young men who are thinking about the future, sort of roll their eyes and sigh at the idea of family dinner with your mom, or going over there and helping your mom with a project, or moving furniture for your grandma. But those really are the seeds of like interdependence between the generations and among the members of the family that create so much meaning right here in this life. We do a lot of homesteading now, where we've got 2 goats, we've got 4 chickens. Those chickens will start laying here soon. Our boy, who eats 2 eggs and a bowl of oatmeal every morning for breakfast, will continue his Gaston diet on homegrown farm fresh eggs very soon. We make bread, we preserve food, we do a lot of canning. These are all things that our kids are getting to watch us do, that they are watching us care for these animals. Just today, our daughter totally independently noticed that the chickens were out of water, opened up their little water, I don't know what you call that little water jug, but
yeah,
took it apart, filled it up, rinsed it out because it was getting a little poopy in there. She cleaned it out, filled it up, reassembled it, and put it back in their coop totally independently. I mean, she's 4, but she already has such an awareness of how to care for an animal and how to care for someone else that she just wouldn't have if we hadn't made those things a priority. And we're not necessarily doing it as like, child, this is your religious work, but she's learning that nonetheless.
Yeah, and it's a more of an organic process. It's not a systematic theology in the way that other monotheistic traditions tend to be. There might be a sub conversation there to get into about how do you interpret myths. Do you just draw from them directly and say, well, Beowulf did this or Odysseus did that, therefore that's a good thing? Or is it a little more complicated? And you can probably guess by how I framed that which way I lean. But I think it's worth returning for a moment to the idea of young men being bored and not particularly motivated by family gatherings, and not really connecting to the value of that, because it strikes me as the sort of thing that you can tell them it's the most important thing all day long, and it's just not going to connect. It's in that category of things that people have to discover for themselves. And maybe, and my take currently, and I'm sure I'll change my mind on this in the future, but it seems like the most functional view of how things are supposed to go, as far as I can tell, is that it's right for those young men to leave for a time, to go out and figure themselves out in the world, not figure themselves out, to make something of themselves on their own in the world. And then as they get a family of their own, which they will if they do a decent job, that knowledge will come to them, and they'll discover that, and then the reconnection becomes possible, and hopefully they still have a family waiting there to be reconnected with.
Yeah, I don't want to say yeah. Absolutely. The last thing I would say on this too is, if you're thinking about paganism and you're thinking about leading your family in this direction, like I'm sort of speaking, assuming most of your audience are male. For me, one of the single biggest things I can do, more than what TV shows I let the kids watch or books I buy for them or chickens I spontaneously come home with, the biggest thing that I can do for them is demonstrate to them how much I love their father and how much we are on the same page and on the same team. And so that looks like, never denigrating my husband in front of my kids. And that's such a popular thing to do online. There are so many memes and jokes about all the annoying ways that dads get in the way and don't understand and didn't take care of things and complaining about their husbands. And I certainly am not going to pretend like my husband is totally faultless, but my children don't know this. I work very hard to make sure that they love and appreciate you as much as I do. And if you're a husband or even a boyfriend who's hoping to maybe one day become a husband, the way you get your girl on board with being shepherded in whatever direction, you may be a Christian listening to this, I don't know who you are. The way you get your girl on board with being shepherded is by being someone of character, being someone with principles and values, talking about them in a spirit of curiosity, not as though you necessarily have the answer, but that you want to explore that answer with her. And pretty soon she'll be making up words like wholesome paganism and begging you to start a podcast so she can talk about it with you, because she's so committed, because you shepherded her so hard.
Well, you're talking about the shepherding as if I am this master of the house, and you are not doing anything behind the scenes or trying to get me to start things or whatever. I think it reminds me, speaking on this whole Christian versus pagan subject, of an amusing little back and forth that Varg Vikernes had with some Catholics online about whether you want a submissive wife or a wife of substance, for lack of a better phrase. And he had a very intentionally politically incorrect question, but he's like, well, the gist is, what kind of kids do you want? Do you want kids that will be obedient slaves to whatever powers that be that they find themselves under? Or do you want children who can think for themselves and challenge people, and who will, at the end of the day, be fun to be around? Because the wife you choose is going to be a model for how they end up. And you talk as if you're some very submissive housewife. Always do what you're told. All that.
Oh no! This is the big fat Greek wedding quote about how wives are the husbands may be the head of the family, but the wife is the neck, and she turns the head any way she wants. No, it's been a team effort, and if you're looking for somebody and you're trying to find someone to do this with, to do life with, finding somebody who works with you to make you both better is the only thing to pursue. And I mean, I don't want to get into like a whole preaching to people who need to get wives, but
I think we're getting into a different podcast subject there at that point.
yes, for sure. But you and I being on the same team, because we've talked these things through and we figured out what values we as a couple have, is why we agreed to have kids together and why they're so awesome and why they're better than the other children. We are definitely a team, and we support each other in the things that we want. I've been the rubber meets the road for a lot of the ideas that you've had and have been growing.
Oh yeah, Letter to Anwei would have been a very, very different and significantly inferior book prior to some much needed editing. But I think we're just past a half hour now. I think the takeaway here to me is that like paganism doesn't have to be this dark esoteric reaction to Christianity. It has all of the, and indeed historically it seemed to be predominantly this much more wholesome, much more unifying, at least at a local level, cultural force and lifestyle that I think is what a lot of people are striving for, but don't have the language to really articulate and explain, and don't know how to look for when they're saying that, they want to, save Western civilization or return to their roots. And they're looking at religious traditions that either really don't really permit that theologically, like Christianity, or outright take joy in destroying it in some of the other darker pagan traditions that we see in the New Age movement.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's some value and some food for thought for our listeners here, and we'll talk again soon.